in supporting the webinar. Also, I would like to thank Professor Alex Edmond for accepting our invitation and his quick response to share his thoughts about how to run responsible business holders' goals. Our thanks and appreciation also extended to Dr. Muhammad for his acceptance of our invitation to share his opinion in the topic of today's webinar. The agenda will start with welcoming remarks from Professor Abdullah Al-Hawaj, the founding president and the chairman of the Board of Trustees of Ahliya University, followed by Professor Mansour, who is the current president of Ahliya University. Then we will, Dr. Muhammad Khamiri will present his thoughts in the subject, followed by Professor Alex Edmond. Professor Al-Hawaj, the floor is yours.
First of all, I would like to, of course, thank the Department of Finance for arranging of Ahliya University for arranging this very, very important topic. And I would like to take this opportunity, of course, to thank our speakers, Dr. Muhammad Mustafa and Professor Edmonds. And of course, I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Bank Al Barakah for their for sponsoring this webinar, and I would like to assure our speakers that Ahliya University, is really active in this subject, and I'm very, very happy to talk to finance people, especially these days. It's very, very important to discuss their views post or during this pandemic. And I always thought, that finance, or in maybe bigger term, economy, or whatever it is, it's the driven, or it drives the whole things. Sometimes I always ask a very, very important question, and the answer is always very difficult. What's happening in the world these days, this pandemic, which I hope we will be able to manage through it. Is it really a pandemic from itself? Is it being done? And there is a lot of theories, and it's all belong of economy and belong of finances, So I really take this opportunity to welcome Alex and to welcome Dr. Muhammad for this very important, and to learn from them and listen to their advice, because this is why we at Ahliya University are interested really to open this discussion. And I always thought, looking at the views of others is always very important. So we listen to only our views, and we start believing ourselves only, but what's happening outside. So it's very, very clear. It's very important to see our speakers. What do they think? What is the future? What's the effect, of course, of COVID-19 and what's going on? So I really take this opportunity to welcome you, and I'm very eager to listen to you and really from you. I'm sure you have your own experience and you have your own views, and especially you come from two different areas or continents. So it's very, very important to share people views and listen to their. I thank very much Dr. Jasim Al-Admi for arranging this important webinar. And inshallah, let's hope we will really come with suggestions or recommendations or things which will improve, inshallah, the future. Thank you very much. I'm very eager to listen to you. And the floor is yours, Jasim, if Professor Mansour would like to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Abdullah. You see, your support and encouragement really used by faculty members, not only at the department, but at the university, as a way of encouragement to go always forward and host distinguished speakers to speak about topical, subjects. It is extremely important. It's not really new, it's an old one, but now the pandemic is actually presenting yet another challenge to businesses. Professor Mansour is a professor of computer science. He is the president of the university, and the floor is yours, Professor Mansour.
Thank you very much. It really gives me great pleasure to really witness such an event at Ahliya and to see such distinguished speakers, willing to give their time to Ahliya faculty and students, and we really highly appreciate it. I also want to thank the College of Business and Finance, and I want to thank the Department of Banking and Finance, Professor Jasim Al-Ajmi being the chair. I think Professor Abdullah, our founding president, has summed it all in a few words, so I really don't want to add that much, but I want to really first really express my appreciation to these two speakers and their impressive CVs. Dr. Muhammad Mustafa, I can see you were the CEO of some kind of learning beacon education and ta'aleem in Dubai. You filled many positions, and really it's really impressive, and we are lucky to have you as a speaker at Ahliya. And I mustn't forget to thank Barakah for really sponsoring this event and giving us some if you like. I noticed that the two speakers both are graduates of MIT. I don't know if that's a coincidence or Professor Jasim arranged it, I don't know. But they're both graduates of MIT. And that Dr. Muhammad, received his scholarship for his education from USAID Technology Transfer Program. So we welcome you, Dr. Muhammad, and wish you the best of luck. Professor Alex, I just put the underlining some key words in the bio, and I stopped marking because every word is significant. I can see that again he is from MIT as a Fulbright professor. You've spoken at Davos, you've testified in the UK Parliament, you've given a number of TED Talks, and I think it just goes on, and it's really difficult to repeat it all. This really gives emphasis that Ahliya is really managing to get international figures, international speakers, prominent personalities, and we should really utilize their presence and benefit from it. I wish you the best of luck, and I really pass you my deep appreciation for taking the time to speak at Ahliya. Thank you very much and welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mansour, for welcoming our distinguished speakers. Our first speaker in this webinar is Dr. Muhammad Mustafa, who has over 23 years of experience in Islamic banking services, management consulting, and education. Prior to joining APG in Feb 2017, Dr. Muhammad worked on different managerial positions with prominent global and GCC-based institutions. He served as the head of Sharia structuring coordination as well as head of Sharia department at Emirates Islamic Bank for more than 8 years. Before that, he was chief operating officer and co-founder of Beacon Education and Ta'aleem in Dubai for a year. Earlier, he worked with McKinsey & Company for 3 years at the firm's Dubai office. He started his career in Islamic banking with Faisal Islamic Bank of Bahrain in late 90s, where he served in various capacities. Last being vice president of corporate and investment banking. He commenced his career with NetBroker as a financial software developer. Dr. Muhammad holds a PhD and MSc in mechanical engineering from MIT. He completed his BSc as well in mechanical engineering from University of Minnesota. He is the recipient of a scholarship of his education for the USA Technology Transfer Program. He's here to share his thoughts about the topic of today's webinar, as well as talking about APG's experience in this matter. The floor is yours, Dr. Muhammad.
Thank you. Can you see my screen? Can you see the screen now?
We are about to, I guess.
Okay. All right. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I really want to thank you and thank the university, Al Ahliya University, for organizing the event and for inviting me. I would like to go through this just brief introduction to what APG has been doing before this crisis, and in terms of the sustainability and social responsibility programs, and then talk about briefly also about what is the implication from what is happening around us, whether here in Bahrain or elsewhere. Now, before talking about our programs, I'll just give you a brief introduction to APG. Al Barakah Banking Group is a pioneer of Islamic banking, or say the pioneer, which started many of the first Islamic banks in different parts of the world. The first one being Jordan Islamic Bank, which was set up back in 1978 in Jordan by the late Sheikh Saleh Kamel. And he went on to establish or acquire different banks and converting them into Islamic banks, but most of them were early startups. So he did set up a bank in Tunisia, converted a bank in Egypt, and set up a bank in Turkey, and so on. In 2002, he brought up all the entities that were set up until that time under the umbrella of Al Barakah Banking Group, which continued to in pioneering Islamic banking in different places. The latest experience we have is the setup of the first Islamic digital bank in Europe, which is called Insha, which is a subsidiary of our unit in Turkey. This map basically gives you an idea of our geographic spread. We have the widest spread in terms of number of branches and geographic spread. We are not the largest bank, but we are quite big. We have our asset base is about 26 billion, and we have more than 700 branches so far, spread across different geographies. We are operating across 14 markets, and we have 2 rep offices in Libya and Indonesia. The markets we are operating in include Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Sudan, South Africa, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Pakistan. The vision of the group is, which is aligned with the original thoughts of the founder, of the pioneer, the late Sheikh Salah Kamel, is that we believe a society needs a fair and equitable financial system, one which rewards effort and contributes to the development of the community. This is a general vision, but we restrict ourselves to operating according to Islamic Sharia and the spirit of Islamic Sharia, or what we call maqasid and aims of Islamic Sharia, which one of the aims are actually what we call the construction of the earth, or a'mal al-ard, that is trying to do good in this world by employing people and by building the societies we are, or communities we are operating in. Back in 2006, few years back in 2015, 2016, a new department was set up at Barakah, which is called the Sustainability and Social Responsibility Department. This department mission was, as highlighted here in this slide, which is driven by Barakah value, was to help improve the quality of life within the communities we operate in, by developing and implementing strategies that are consistent with the vision of the group. And the department has been working on, and in 2016, we actually signed up to the social development goals of the United Nations. And I'll explain to you shortly what these goals are and what we have been doing so far. But the department basically set up different programs which build on what's already going on at the Islamic banks. As you know, Islamic banks, they work according to Islamic Sharia, and part of what they do also on the side, which is actually paying zakah and paying that through different programs. And actually there are some profits sometimes that are considered not to be acceptable, and they maybe have to be paid to charities. So these are some of the things that we are doing. Also, in terms of activities that we finance or invest in, these are restricted and have to be aligned with Islamic Sharia. So we don't invest in things like arms or tobacco or vice, whatever that is. This program, the SSR programs, include 4 types. The first one is Barakah Philanthropic Program, which includes, this is based on philanthropy, and it includes areas like education, supporting education, community development, arts, culture, literature, scholarly and literary works, youth engagements and sports, environment and sustainability, etc. The second program that is under the umbrella of the SSR department are Barakah Economic Opportunities and Social Investment Programs. And these include community development and supporting micro and small medium enterprises through financing them, basically, and supporting local and other industries, investing in local and other industries in various geographies and various communities. The third program is Barakah Qard Hasan program, which is basically interest-free loans that we give to different sections of society, like such as the small producers or farmers and entrepreneurs. The fourth program includes the Barakah Time Commitment, which is based on time dedicated from staff, from the staff and employees of the group overall. Now we have, throughout the group, we have about 12,000 employees of our own, and part of this program is encouraging people to donate some of their times to social causes in their respective communities. The fifth program, which I mentioned earlier, is the support of the United Nations Development Goals, where we have signed up to 7 of these goals, including number 1, that is trying to eradicate poverty, health, education, gender equality, clean energy, etc. And actually, what we did is actually we made some commitment for specific goals. So one of the goals that we signed up to is through our financing and through our investments and etc. We aim over a period of between 2016 to 2020. We aim to support the creation of about 51,000 jobs. And this is done mostly through, like, for example, when we finance any company, we ask one of the questions we ask is how many jobs this is going to create. This would basically enhance or facilitate. We also committed to finance or support education programs up to 191 million. And the same for healthcare, more than 400 million, that's 434. For sustainable energy, this is a new commitment which we signed up on only last year. So for sustainable energy, we are committing to support it up to close to 200 million. This is the progress we had up until the end of 2018. Now we have a slight delay in terms of the information we get from our different units, how accurate it is up to 1 year. So far, it's up until end of 2018. This is in 2018 itself, the job creation was more than 10,000. Sorry, the target was more than 10,000, and the jobs created in that year were about 7,600 just for that year. And I will give you later on the aggregate as of the end of 2018. And for education, this is what has been achieved in 2018. We managed to fund up to 40 million programs, and the target for that year was about 38 million. So we overachieved for that year, and the same thing is for healthcare. Overall, this is the scorecard basically for up to end of 2018. You see that for the job creation, we have achieved by that time about 58% of the overall targets. For education, we achieved about 95% of the target, whereas for healthcare, we achieved 91% of the target. And for this year, we are doing the reporting, and I think we will exceed the targets for a few of these commitments. But we still have up until the end of 2020. So by 2019, we already covered quite a few of these commitments. Now, as you can see, this program was set up before the crisis, and it's embedded in the way we work throughout the geographies we're operating in. So we were already prepared in the sense of trying to focus on what would be beneficial for society overall, for the communities that we are working in. And I think for the COVID-19 crisis has, of course, affected everyone, and it's affecting us, it's affecting the units that we are operating in, and to different degrees. And as you know, the effects of the crisis in different places is a function both of the the severity of the measures that are taken by the governments in these countries, plus the packages that these governments have set up to support the economies. So the first priority that we had when the crisis started back in early January, actually, as we have started getting the reports from China, and we were monitoring the reports almost on a daily basis. The first thing that we paid attention to was the safety of our people, the safety of our staff, the safety of our customers, and we have coordinated different measures throughout the units that we are operating in to ensure that we are taking the appropriate measures in coordination, of course, with the local authorities and with the regulators, that to safeguard our people and to safeguard our staff. And we have the benefit of actually having been informed from different areas, so there is a shared knowledge and a shared expertise that we can communicate instantly. Now, after that, of course, we start to get the effects based on the measures that are taken by the governments. If there is a severe lockdown, then you can see that the effect on the economic activity and the potential revenues of the units that we have and the potential costs. And that we are currently monitoring, trying to adjust our budgets accordingly, and trying to work our way around that with the least damage, of course. Now, definitely the programs that we have committed to, they may be affected a bit, but overall the targets that we have, I think we probably are going to achieve them. It's just that we are not going to overachieve as much as we hope to. But I think we will be able to achieve. There would be an effect in terms of how much excess we will have to support other causes and so on, because even if the financial sector may not be directly hit by the crisis, it is still exposed to all the real sectors in the economy, and definitely it's going to get the after effects of that. So overall, just to conclude, that we were ready before the crisis and we are handling it accordingly, and we hope that the effect would not be everlasting. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. If you can, okay. If you can mute yourself, Dr. Muhammad.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, our next speaker is Alex Edmond, who is a professor of finance at London Business School. Alex has a PhD from MIT as a Fulbright scholar and was previously a tenured professor at Wharton and an investment banker at Morgan Stanley. Alex has spoken at the World Economic Forum in Davos, testified in the UK Parliament, and given the TED Talk, What to Trust in a Post-Truth World, at the TEDx Talk, The Social Responsibility of Business, with combined 2 million views. He has appeared on Bloomberg, BBC, CNBC, CNN, ITV, Sky News, and Sky Sports, and written for Financial Times, Harvard Business School, and Wall Street Journal. At Wharton, he won 14 teaching awards in 6 years. At LBS, he won the Excellent in Teaching Award for the best professor across all programs. He has been named to Boyd's and Quant's best 40 professors and Thinker 50 radar. Actually, if I were to go over his bio, then I would not give him a chance to speak and well, to pass his views to you. And therefore, I'll stop here and to give Alex the floor. The floor is yours, Alex.
Well, thank you so much, Jasim. It's really great to be here. Thank you to everybody who's helped set this up, and to everybody for joining, because I know that these are difficult times. So thank you for being willing to give up an hour or two to hear my thoughts. And while one of the really sad things about the pandemic is obviously the inability to travel, one of the silver linings is the ability to give webinars to places that I would not normally have a chance to travel to. So I really appreciate this. So I'm going to give a talk on responsible business in a time of crisis. I'll try to be about 35 minutes, and so that there'll be time for questions at the end. Now, I don't know about you, but in the UK, we've been locked down for about 4 months now. But I will take you at least on a metaphorical journey outside your home offices to around the world. So I'm going to take you to the Great Rift Valley. So this stretches across 2 continents, from Lebanon in Asia to Mozambique in Africa. It stretches for 2,000 kilometers. And it has some of the world's highest mountains. It also has some of the world's deepest lakes. And one of these lakes is called Lake Magadi, which is on the southernmost tip of the Great Rift Valley. Now, you might think you haven't seen this lake before. It's hard to imagine that you're here. But in fact, some of you might have seen it before in the movie The Constant Gardener, based on the John le Carré novel of the same name. And indeed, millions of people around the world may have seen this lake because of the movie, but fewer than 1,000 people call the lake their home. And one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Saronga, who makes a living selling and herding goats. Now, it used to be that for Emmanuel, cash was king. So it was cash that he used to receive when he sold a goat. It was cash that he'd have to then check for robbery and then store in case it was, and be worried about it being forged. And then if he wanted to bank that cash, he would have to trek for an entire day to the nearest bank. So his life was really, really difficult. And that all changed in 2007 because of a responsible business. And that responsible business was Vodafone. So Vodafone launched a mobile money service called M-Pesa, which was a huge difference to the people who were in Kenya. So let me explain what mobile money is, because some people confuse it with mobile banking. So mobile banking is if I have a bank account, I can operate it on the phone rather than going to the branch. But with mobile money, you don't even need a bank account to begin with. And that's really powerful because many Kenyans did not even have access to banking to begin with. And so this transformed the life of Emmanuel Saronga. So he no longer needs to deal with cash. He no longer needs to deal with forged money. He no longer needs to worry about being robbed, and he can graze his goats on the greenest pastures. He doesn't need to live within 1 day of a bank. And more generally, there was a study by the alma mater of Dr. Muhammad and me, MIT. So a professor there found that in the first 7 years of M-Pesa, 200,000 households got lifted out of poverty. And many of them were headed up by women because they could move from agriculture to business and retail. So there was a huge effect of M-Pesa. But let me now tell you a different story about Vodafone. And this other story concerns tax. So in 2012, Vodafone became the first telecoms company in the telecoms industry worldwide to release a tax transparency report showing how much tax they were paying to governments around the world. And that's really important in telecoms because you could choose to locate your licenses in low tax regimes. So I have 2 questions for everybody on this webinar. The first is, which of these decisions created most value for society? And the second is, which decision, if it had not been taken, would have led to the most public outrage or worsened Vodafone's CSR, corporate social responsibility, rating, or reputation. Now, I'm not going to poll anybody on this webinar because I'm pretty sure that most people would answer the same. So which decision created most value for society? It was M-Pesa. By launching it, you lifted 200,000 households out of poverty. But what would have happened had you not launched M-Pesa? Nothing. There would probably have been no media backlash, right? You don't get in trouble for not doing something great, right? The media would have never expected you to be able to do something like launch M-Pesa to begin with. But what is the backlash if you are not transparent on tax? That could be massive, right? So indeed, Vodafone, 2 years previously, there was a story by UK Uncut, a UK citizens group, showing that Vodafone had avoided £6 billion of tax legally, but maybe not morally. And around the same time, there was a report that the Chancellor, George Osborne, announced £6 billion of spending cuts. So you could see what the headlines were, right? You, the taxpayer, is suffering £6 billion of austerity because of this really greedy company. And so what that led to was boycotts of the Vodafone stores. And so this is why my view of responsibility might differ from the traditional view. So responsibility is absolutely about fairness, right? You can't cheat on taxes, you shouldn't pay too low wages, you shouldn't pollute the environment. But you didn't need to come on this webinar to hear that. Right? You already knew that responsibility is not about damaging your reputation, it's about doing no harm. But what I want to do is I want to shift our thinking on responsibility to say it's not just about do no harm, it's about actively doing good. So pursuing innovation and excellence and doing things such as launching M-Pesa to lift households out of poverty, that's much more what responsibility is about. It's not just about creating harm. So I like to represent this by using a pie. So the pie shows how much value a company creates for society. And that pie could be split either to investors in the form of profits or society in the form of taxes to the government or wages to workers or fair prices to customers. And we often think that responsibility is about splitting the pie fairly. So we want to move from this to that. Well, and absolutely that's important, right? We need to be fair, but again, you knew that before coming on this webinar. I didn't want to just tell you what we already know. Instead, what I want to stress is that responsibility cannot just be about splitting the pie in a certain way. Why? Well, there's at least two problems with viewing responsibility that way. First is that, well, it's bad for the company, because if responsibility is about splitting the pie and making the company less profitable, then many people might not want to do this. And indeed, there's a concern that many companies don't really care about responsibility, but they are just doing some greenwashing or making some great public relations statements without actually putting it into practice. And the second reason why responsibility can't just be about splitting the pie differently is that it's bad for investors. Now, some people might think, well, I don't care, right? Because we often like to portray investors as nameless, faceless capitalists, right? We don't mind taking from investors. Investors are them, and society is us. So if we can take from investors and give to us, that seems to be good. However, that's not the case, right? Because investors are not them, they are us. So they include parents saving for their children's education. They include pension funds saving for retirement. They include insurance companies setting aside to fund future claims. So any repurposing of business must take investors very seriously. So this is why my view about responsible business is very different. It's about growing the pie. So we absolutely do want to create more orange, create more value, but the way that we do this is not by redistributing and giving a greater slice to what was already there. It's not about corporate philanthropy or charitable donations. It's instead about innovation and excellence and coming up with new ideas and new products. So when Vodafone launched M-Pesa, they did that genuinely to try to create more value for society. But then as a byproduct, they were eventually able to monetize it, and so investors became better off. Okay, so what I call this approach is I call it pie economics. Now, you could either love or hate that phrase, but regardless of whether you like that word, let me define it. It seeks to create profits only through creating value for society. So what do I mean by this? Right, so the final 4 words should be uncontroversial. So before coming on the webinar, you would have already known that responsibility is about creating value for society. But the new bit is the first part. It seeks to create profits through creating value for society. So it doesn't just choose to donate money to charity, it serves society as a byproduct of, and it serves society in a way that is also profitable. But the other important word here is only, right? Because you could create profits without creating value for society. For example, it could be that you are price gouging customers, but the word only suggests that profits are a byproduct. They are not something that are pursued directly. Okay, so at this point, you might think, well, everything Alex says, that sounds great, but where is the evidence? Is there something which is actually true? And so this is what I do as a professor, this is what Jazim does, and any academic will try to do, is try to make sure that anything that we say is backed up by rigorous evidence rather than just being a nice story. Because you might think it's wishful thinking to think that companies that create value for society magically just happen to be more profitable in the long term. And the important thing about evidence is that we need to be really careful about it. Why? Because of this idea of confirmation bias. This is the concern that people would like to accept evidence if it confirms what people would like to be true. Right? So if it confirms what you'd like to be true, you accept it, and if it rejects it, then you just contradict, you just don't believe their evidence. And that's a particular issue with a responsible business, but we'd love to live in a world in which ethical companies do better. So we might just accept a study which claims that even if the evidence is weak. And indeed, the TED talk that Jazim kindly referred to, What to Trust in a Post-Truth World, that highlights the danger of confirmation bias, the importance of focusing on the most rigorous research. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this. You can watch that in your own time if it's of interest. But let me just show you this, just to give you one example of confirmation bias. And this is Forbes. So Forbes wrote about a study saying that it found that companies that excel in sustainability and responsibility outperform their peers and are susceptible to fewer risks. Now, there's no problem with that paragraph. But here's the problem. It's the next one. That is the premise of a new report, and it is an accurate one, judging by many conversations with those interested in better business and a sustainable future. So how does the journalist judge whether the report is accurate? She doesn't scrutinize the methodology. She simply asks people who believe in responsible business, do you think that the study is true? And obviously they're going to say so. So this is not a reliable way to evaluate evidence. So instead, what I wanted to do is to look at very carefully what is the evidence for responsible business, right? Are companies that serve society, do they deliver higher long-term value, or are they just fluffy companies that are distracted from the bottom line? Now, to do this, I needed to find a measure of how well a company treats wider society. And so what I looked at was a measure of employee satisfaction, so how well a company treats its workers. So why did I look at that rather than, say, taxes or the environment? For a couple of reasons. So first is this data was available from 1984. So I had tons of data, and that's really important because many measures of responsibility have only been around for 5 or 10 years, right? ESG is a pretty new phenomenon. And if I only had data since 2010, you might be worried. Why? Because the last 10 years have been really have been a real upswing. And if I found a relationship, you might be worried that, well, this is something which is only true in an economic expansion, maybe in a pandemic, which is where we are now. Responsibility is a luxury, so we should just focus on profit. So that's one reason. The second reason why I use this data set is it's really thorough. So it looks at employee well-being. It doesn't just look at quantitative factors like pay and benefits, but also qualitative factors such as trust in management, pride in your job, and camaraderie with your colleagues. And so what I wanted to do is to look at whether the companies on this list, whether they beat their peers or were just fluffy companies that were distracted from the bottom line. Now, there's a number of challenges, right? Because Google is on this list. Google has done really well, but how do we know that it's due to employee satisfaction? It could just be that the tech industry happened to do well, or some other factor. So for every company on this list, we had to control for what industry you're in, for your size, for your recent performance. And as we know, that correlation does not imply causation. So I had to do further tests to suggest that it's employee satisfaction that leads to better performance, rather than better performance allowing a company to invest in employee satisfaction. So it took me 4 years to complete the study to make sure that everything was robust. And what did I find at the end? It was that the 100 best companies to work for in America delivered stock returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% cumulative. So this is serious business. Companies that treat their workers well, they're not just being fluffy, they're being sustainable and productive. Okay, so now I'm going to have 3 short sections on what this means for practitioners. So, which is what most people on this audience are. So what does this academic study mean for the real world? And then I'll open it up to questions. So the first is it highlights just how important responsibility is. So for companies, we often think about this as being CSR. And I have not really used that term CSR today. Why? Because CSR has the connotation of being a non-core activity, which is just delegated to the CSR department. Instead, what I'm highlighting is that responsibility is a CEO level issue. It's something that should be central to the firm because it's linked to its long-term performance. And similarly, what does it mean for investors? So I'm really grateful that the CFA Institute of Bahrain is partnering in this webinar. Right, many people here will be investors. Now, the traditional view is that factors like employee satisfaction, those are non-financial factors that you should only take into account if you are a socially responsible investor. If your goal is not just to make money, but also to contribute towards better working practices or gender diversity. However, what happens if you're an investor and all you want to do is make as much money as possible? Right, that is still a fair objective, right? Because you need to do so. If you're a pension fund, you need to provide for retirement. What the evidence suggests is that even if your only goal is a financial one, you should pay attention to these non-financial factors, because these non-financial factors become financial in the long term. So, how do we put it into practice? Right, we've said it's important. How do we put it into practice? Well, Dr. Muhammad already gave some great examples of how his bank is doing that. but let me try to give a framework which we can apply in general to whatever company you're in, be it a bank or be it a pharmaceuticals firm or be it a transport company. Now, let me address what the elephant in the room is, which is how to make decisions, right? Because we know how to make decisions if the goal is shareholder value, right? Finance professors like me have been teaching this for the last 50 years. But if instead we want to make decisions based on responsibility, well, how do we make those decisions? We need something to replace, or at least to supplement, net present value. And so in chapter 3 of a book that I recently wrote, I developed 3 principles. I'm only going to go through one of them because I want to make sure there's enough time for questions. And that's the principle of materiality. Now, in order to define the principle of materiality, let me define what I mean by purpose, right? Because purpose has been a subtext to my talk, but I haven't really defined it yet. So we often think about a purposeful company as being one that serves wider society. We think that purposeful means altruistic. I actually mean that, right? If we think about the word purposeful, it means targeted or focused. Right, a purposeful company is one with a clear objective. A purposeful meeting is one with a clear objective. If I do something on purpose, I do it deliberately. So a purposeful company is one which is targeted and focused. And I think that's really important because many companies get this wrong. So if you look here, right, some companies will have a purpose statement like, our purpose is to serve customers, workers, suppliers, the environment, communities, and investors. Well, that sounds great, but it's unrealistic because in the real world, there are trade-offs, right? So you might be Engie, the French energy company, and you might think, should I shut down this coal-fired power station? If I do, it's going to be good for the environment, but it's bad for workers. So if my purpose is to serve both workers and the environment, I don't know how to evaluate this trade-off. So I define purpose as the answer to the question, how is the world a better place by my company being here? And the answer to that must be targeted and focused. Right, and so this goes to the idea of materiality. So what does materiality mean? Yes, there's lots of stakeholders, but which are the ones that are the most important? And so what I'm going to show you here is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board materiality map. And so what that says is that for different industries, different stakeholders are more important. So if you're in the first column, which is extractives and minerals processing, the environment is really important because if there's a flood, you can't access your mine. But if you're a bank like Dr. Muhammad, well, maybe the environment is not so important. So the more important things are social capital. So ideas like customer privacy, data security, and selling practices. And so what that means is that even though we know that climate change is the order of the day, well, actually, we might be better off focusing, if we're a bank, on social capital because that's particularly important to us. And that's linked to the final academic study that I'm going to mention, which is this one here. This is a really powerful paper. So it takes the data set by MSCI, which is perhaps the best known data set on ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance. And they found that companies that do well on every ESG issue across the board outperform by 1.5% per year, which is insignificant. So there's really no difference between companies that do well on everything and the average company. But then they revisited it and they looked at, well, if the company does well on the material issues and scales back on the immaterial ones, then it does beat the market by 4.83% per year. So that's really interesting because it suggests that it's better to do well on only a few areas than to do well on everything. And that's really important, right? Because we often think about responsibility as a box ticking exercise. So to the investors here, right, we often try to look at, does a company do well on customers and employees and the environment? But actually, it might be better to have a company which is only doing well on a few things, because they recognize that actually it's important to be focused, and responsibility is just about knowing, as much about knowing what not to do as what to do. So this takes me on to the final section, which is how do we think about this in the crisis? So in the crisis, we've had some amazing actions by some companies to try to help out wider society. And so a lot of these actions are pie splitting, where people are accepting smaller slices of the pie in order to help others. So this might involve executives. So in terms of executive pay, right, the chairman of Email, which is a Middle Eastern real estate company, right, he's taking 0 pay. Senior management are taking a half pay, and then the people at the lower ranks are taking full pay. And there's some companies which are helping workers, right? Unilever is guaranteeing the jobs of all of its 150,000 workers, including contractors, so not just directly employed staff. And some are helping customers. So El Habtoor has donated 50 ambulances, and restaurants throughout the Middle East region are giving food and groceries to local communities. So these are all fantastic actions, right? Any company which is engaging in pie splitting, giving up part of the pie, should be widely applauded. However, the problem with pie splitting is not every company can split the pie differently, right? So what if you are not in an industry, you're not an ambulance manufacturer, or you're not making food and groceries? Can you help out? Or what if you just can't afford to do this? You don't have money because you're a small company. So this is why I started my talk with the importance of pie growing. Is responsibility is not just about throwing money at a problem, but asking yourself, what is in my hand? What are the resources that my company has? And how can I reallocate them by thinking creatively, by being innovative, like Vodafone launching M-Pesa? How can I reallocate my resources to serve wider society? And I think what's really powerful about this is it means that every company can help out in the crisis. So let's take companies in unrelated industries. You could take Chelsea Football Club in the UK. Right, football has nothing to do with the crisis. However, what is in their hand is they've got a hotel, and they're allowing doctors and nurses to stay at the hotel after a day in the hospital, so they don't have to travel all the way home, which is a long and uncertain commute, and it's dangerous on public transport. Or you could be Ford, who's using airbag material to make masks, or a perfume company, which is now making sanitizer. What if you're a large company hit by a crisis? Let's say you're an airline, Qantas Airways in Australia, right? They would love to keep paying their workers who are furloughed, but they just can't afford to do so because they're going to go bankrupt. They don't have money. But what is in their hand is a relationship, and that relationship is with Woolworths, which is a grocery store in Australia. And that relationship used to be that if you bought groceries in Woolworths, you could get air miles on Qantas. Now, but what they've done is they've leveraged that relationship to make it sort of much bigger now. And now that relationship is such that if you're a furloughed employee from Qantas, you can work now at Woolworths, so you still keep your job. And finally, what if you're a small company and you can't help out because you just don't have money? Well, let me give you an example of a company that I'm a customer of. It's called Barry's Boot Camp. It is a gym in London, but throughout the world. So there's a couple of locations in Dubai. David Beckham is one of the clients at this gym. Now, they are clearly shut at the moment because of the lockdown. But what is in their hand? Well, what they can offer is providing free online fitness classes, which is really important because many people are self-isolating at home. Now, you might think, well, that's not very creative. A fitness company is just offering fitness classes. But here is the great thing. What if you are a desk worker? Right? You work on the desk of the gym. How can you help out in the crisis when the gym is shut down? What it turns out is that some of those gym workers are actually actors as their main job. Now, if you're acting, right, that is an uncertain job. So many of them take this job at the gym in order to provide stability of income. Now, if you are an actor, what is in your hand is that you're really funny. Well, how can that help out in the crisis? Well, there's a lot of parents with their children at home because the schools are shut, and so they're able to entertain the children, providing Zoom entertainment sessions or storytelling sessions. So that might be a really small thing, but it highlights how we can think creatively about what is in our hand and how we can use it to serve wider society, just like Ali University has thought about, well, putting on this webinar to begin with. And so while the pandemic has been really serious, and there's obviously many negatives, if there's one small silver lining, it's that it will encourage companies to think more that responsibility is not just about pie splitting or donations, but to think creatively about what is in your hand and how can you use it to serve society. So I'm going to turn it over to questions very shortly, but there's just one final slide, which is if you're interested in reading further about this, I just released a book called Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit on Amazon, on Kindle and so forth. And so that's about responsible business. Now, there are other books about their own responsible business, but most of them view profit as evil and the investors as the enemy. They're saying, well, companies should be charities. But actually, what I wanted to show was that responsibility is fully consistent with a company being profitable and investors generating returns. So this shows responsibility can be commercial. It's not just about charity. And it's based on a lot of rigorous evidence, but a lot of the academic evidence is written in a very dense way for academic journals. So what I wanted to do was to bring this to life with a lot of real world examples and frameworks. Okay, so thank you so much to everybody for their attention. Let me hand back to Jasmine now and to take any questions that people have. We've probably got about 15 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Alex. Well, for this very, very interesting presentation and recommendations for practitioners. And while your presentations created a lot of interest, it looks that, well, questions are coming, many questions. I don't know whether we have time to entertain all of them. Well, Professor Gagan's question, despite of many new accounting standards and modifications made during years and decades, companies are not behaving responsibly. What are your thoughts about these?
I think this is a great question. I think part of it is the fact that, as indeed the question suggests, that the data is not perfect. There's a lot of data sources out there, but they're not great at measuring responsibility. And why is that? I think a lot of the data sources are about do no harm. So they're about the harm that a company creates, such as carbon emissions or water usage. Whereas what I've tried to highlight is a responsible business is about actively doing good. And so things like Vodafone and Apesa, which are not captured by most responsibility dimensions. So there's two things I'd answer. That's one is that there is actually some increase in data innovation, which tries to look at actively doing good. So I'm putting this into the meeting chat. I'm not sure, hopefully everybody can see it, but there's the concept of impact weighted accounts, which some professors at Harvard are trying to develop, which tries to look at the positive good that a company does. But the second thing is that actually it means that evaluating responsibility is not just about looking at data. So there's some investors who think, well, if we have a perfect data set, we can just, but in fact, a lot of responsibility involves going out and talking to companies and talking to CEOs and looking in their eyes and asking them, how do they make decisions? So what I'm putting into chat, this is a journal here by a responsible investor, and that journal is called 12 Markets in 12 Months. And it does exactly what it says on the tin. these investors will not invest in a company unless they've looked at management, they've talked to management, they visited the factories. And so these are all in countries outside the UK, the US. So they visited Turkey, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and so on. And they found that you could really get a lot out of boots on the ground investing, asking questions. And you might think, shouldn't the CEO know how to answer the questions? Maybe he's been given some great preparation. But that's not the case. They found that even some basic questions were a great way of figuring out whether a company was responsible or not. So we can't just rely on data.
Thank you. Well, another question, does evidence suggest that creating stakeholders' value under pie economics will not only generate profits, but that these profits will, in the long run, in the long term, often be done under profit maximization?
So could you read the last part of that of Jasim? I didn't understand that last part.
Let me write. Does evidence suggest that creating stakeholders' value under pie economics will not only generate profits, but that these profits will, in the long term, often be than under profit maximization? This is from Stephen Page.
So I think it will be higher than under profit maximization. Thanks, Steve. So why is that? It's because this is what the study on employee satisfaction is suggesting, is that we're taking companies that treat their employees well, and then we compare them to other companies which have moderate employee satisfaction, and that outperforms to 184% per year.
How can we trust, as probably outsiders, CSR without any assurance?
Yeah, so this is important, but some of these standards, there are some reporting standards now where you can have your CSR, your impact reports audited. So in the same way that you can have financial statements audited, you can have sustainability reports audited, and I think that's important. There's also reporting frameworks. For example, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, what they do is they provide a framework, and that framework says what metrics you should report on. And so that's important because it means that they're choosing what metrics they want to, but they're reporting the metrics that people say, that bodies are saying are the relevant metrics. And that's important. Otherwise, you could just choose whatever metrics you happen to do well on.
Thank you. With Alex, people always think so paradox here. The Industrial Revolution created a lot of pollution as a consequences of industrialization, but had a huge positive impact on the well-being of the world's population. Now, how can this be resolved, not only at the company's level, but also at economics overall?
Yeah, so I think this is really important, and this highlights the importance of not having binary thinking, but trying to consider a company holistically. Is that I do think the Industrial Revolution had a lot of benefit. Yes, there's indeed a lot of pollution. There was at the time so the labour standards were really difficult, but maybe in the absence of that, there would have been much more poverty. So we want to look at a company holistically. And so one company that is particularly controversial is Amazon. So I serve on the Responsible Investment Advisory Committee for Royal London Asset Management, which runs 5 sustainable funds. And Amazon we hold shares in that. And that's really controversial because Amazon does have undesirable working practices. But on the other hand, we say, well, it's creating a lot of value in terms of making products available to customers at low prices. It makes product reviews available and so forth. So I think when we ask the question, how is the world a better place by my company being here? We want to look at, is the company creating a net benefit to society? Do we think that the customer benefits of Amazon outweigh the labour practices? Now, that's clearly a subjective factor. There's no data that would evaluate it. But what I encourage investors to think about is to think about the benefits of a company as well as just the cost, and to have that holistic evaluation. And even if we do think it's a company we want to invest in, certainly we'd like to engage with the company and try to encourage it to improve its workplace practices. And indeed, we see them giving bonuses to warehouse workers in the pandemic. But I do think that with these paradoxes, we want to look at the good that companies actively create, not just the bad and the harm.
Well, another question, is social value the same thing as stakeholders' values? Or are they the same, or do they overlap?
Yes. I would define those as the same thing. So social value and stakeholder value, that's the amount of value that you're delivering to wider society. Those stakeholders might be employees, by giving them wages or meaningful work or better working conditions or psychological safety. It could be the environment, customers, communities, and so forth. I define them as the same.
Another question is related to how to make companies behave responsibly. Is it by law? Like
okay,
or leave it to the market? Or probably give incentive, for example, tax for taxation, because you see, as you know, in the US, for example, for corporate governance is more towards being a law rather than compared with the UK approach, simply comply or explain. And I'm sure you came across many studies that shows, well, comply and explain, generally they don't probably explain, and if they do explain, they are not offering good explanation why they are not complying with the code.
Yeah, so I'd be much more in terms of the market rather than the law or taxes. So why is that? The law and taxes, they can ensure compliance with certain codes or regulations, but not true commitment. And why is that particularly important? Is that many things about responsibility you cannot legislate. Well, if responsibility is about actively doing good through innovation, right, that M-Pays, for example, could have never been legislated. Or indeed about employee satisfaction, which is what I studied. Yes, you can have legislation on minimum wages, but you can't have legislation on providing meaningful work to your workers. You can't have legislation on giving people the opportunity to step up when they're junior and maybe give presentations to clients and so on. So I do think it's something that companies need to voluntarily do. But then how does the market work? Well, first there's investors, and I think responsible investors are really important because they are really scrutinizing these companies and evaluating them not just in financial factors but non-financial ones as well. But another big thing is responsible sourcing or responsible procurement. So if you look at, say, the responsible sourcing standards of Nestle or Unilever, they're providing full-blown audits of the companies that they're buying from, their human rights, their labour practices, whether they engage in bribery and so forth. And so I think those are really powerful ways of encouraging companies to act more responsibly. So certainly the law, we can use the law for certain things that can be mandated, like minimum wages or no child labour. But I think there's many things which are beyond the law that we would like the market to do.
But isn't it your suggestion saying, well, you need probably an active market and active investors that would, and probably institutional investors that may play a role in disciplining company to behave responsibly?
You do, and actually there's quite a lot of evidence showing that the investors do play that role. So there's a lot of like caricature. People love to say that investors, they only care about short-term profit. But in particular, chapter 6 of the book provides evidence that even hedge funds, who are often seen as evil and only caring about money, they still care about these responsible factors as well. So actually these investors do not just extract more of the pie from themselves, but they grow the pie for wider society.
Well, also another question is related to the intention of the US Department of Justice recently, or proposing that will actually, they may pass a law disciplining or requiring pension funds solely to comply solely to what modern portfolio theory states. Base your decisions on financial risk and return. What do you think that may have an impact on companies well, adhering to ESG standards or required?
Yeah, so I was quite disappointed with this. So this is the Department of Labour saying that the default pension fund can't be an ESG fund. But I think that there are certain ESG funds that might outperform because they're taking these non-financial dimensions into account in a good way. For example, there is a fund called the Parnassus Endeavour Fund, and this is a fund which invests on the employee satisfaction strategy that I highlighted, and it's been the best performing fund Morningstar found over the last 1, 2, 5 and 10 years, and so that delivers higher financial returns as well. So clearly, right, we can't say any ESG fund is good because there's some ESG funds who look at the wrong dimensions, they don't take materiality into account, but there are some ESG funds that do it well, and so I think you just can't just rule out the ESG fund. So what matters is for the default fund to be one that does it well, and I think the Department of Labour is incorrect in this.
Well, FRC asked Big Four to break down their businesses. That's just recently in the UK, isn't it? Yeah. Businesses into auditing and non-auditing. Any comments on ethical behavior of the audit firms who made millions of pounds and did not behave responsibly? Now talking about supposedly those who should protect investors or protect outsiders from what companies do.
Yeah, and so this is a case where I do think the market does work, is that if you're an auditing firm and you're not protecting investors, your reputation could be massively shot. So Arthur Andersen, right, that firm basically went under because of Enron. And similarly, there's auditing firms within the UK which have been linked in some scandals. So Grant Thornton, under their prior CEO, Sasha Romanovich, they were hugely about purpose, but then they were caught up in the scandal of, I think it was Patisserie Valerie, which found a huge hole in their accounts. And so I think this is a case where there's companies that make great statements, but if they're connected with fraudulent accounts, that is a huge problem for them.
Is there any, cultural dimension to what you are proposing? Meaning, cultural, we are talking about examples coming from Anglo-Saxon environments. What about Asian, probably, culture? Do you think culture may have an impact of how companies are managed or run? See, for example, now recently, in India, the government took a decision to split the role of chair and CEO. They need to be two people. And there are pressure from industry. The Indian government decided to postpone the implementation of this requirements additional 2 years, and instead of April 2020, postponed it to 2022.
Yeah, so I think in terms of cultural factors, so I think I would say it's more context rather than just culture. So what responsibility means will be different in different countries. So like in the UK and the US, they might say McDonald's is not a responsible company. Why? Because it encourages, it's fast food and it's unhealthy. But maybe in more developing countries where maybe incomes are lower, then McDonald's could be responsible. Why? Because if it's expensive for people to go out and take their family out for a meal, actually something like a McDonald's, which allows people to take their family out for a meal at affordable prices, could be responsible. So we have to be very careful trying to apply UK and US standards to other countries without taking the context into account. So I'd say it's the context more than just the culture, is that the problems that exist in different countries around the world will be different. And so if income standards are lower in certain countries, I would say providing an affordable product is more important than providing one which is going to be the most nutritious.
Well, another question, we are seeing government involvement like India. In India, for example, in setting CSR policies as a means to encourage improvement in the overall welfare of society by setting essentially a tax. That's what he believes, or she believes, which in order to support society's cause. And the same thing in Kuwait. In Kuwait, companies are required to pay used to be 2.5 and now 2% from out of their profits to support research. What do you think of these approaches?
So I think, I think we should be careful about them. Again, this goes back to my earlier answer that I'm not sure that responsibility is something that you can legislate. So the issue with the 2% in India, where you have to give 2% of your profits to CSR initiatives, the question is why, right? Because if instead of giving those profits to CSR initiatives, the company could instead pay higher dividends to their shareholders, and then shareholders could decide what social causes to support. So it's not clear why the company does that any better than shareholders. So shareholders should be allowed to do it themselves rather than the CEO just choosing what social cause she wants to support. So I think that could be an issue. And also for some companies, it might be that the best thing they could invest in is their core business. If they're a pharmaceuticals firm, don't give to CSR, invest in new drugs. So maybe that 2% is too high for some companies. For other companies, maybe it's too low. So the problem with regulation is that it's one size fits all. So Jasmine, I'm sorry that I will only have time for, I think, one more question because I have to hop onto another webinar. I'm doing something for the International Corporate Governance Network. But what I will say is I see there's a lot of questions and I'm really grateful for everybody who's asking questions. So if you drop me a note on LinkedIn, if you send the question by LinkedIn, I will promise to get back to you. It's really great to see such so many questions. And one of the questions was from Stephen Page, and actually he's been a real great supporter of the book. He actually wrote a review of it. So I'm going to put in the announcements here. Hopefully people can see it. Just a link to the review that he made of the book, so that's somebody else's viewpoint, and so I really appreciate that. But just choose one more question, Jasmine, and I'd be happy to answer that, and I'll answer the other ones by LinkedIn.
Well, Alex, there are many questions, and therefore it's quite difficult for me to pick. What I will leave now the stage to our founding president, Professor Al-Hawaj, to have a word at the end. I know you have to join another webinar a few minutes from now, and therefore we want you actually to be ready for the other one. The floor is yours, Professor Abdullah.
Assalamu alaikum. Hey, sorry I was interrupted a few times, but I would like to take this opportunity, of course, to thank our speakers for a very interesting webinar, and I hope that our professors here will learn from it a lot. And I take this opportunity to thank them very much for participating. And I thank really the College of Business and Finance and the Department of Banking and Finance for arranging this webinar with very distinguished two speakers. I take this opportunity hoping, since we've heard you now, that soon, inshallah, we could have another one face-to-face. And I hope that we will use some of the views we've listened to. And I take this opportunity to thank you and to wish you all the best. And let's hope, inshallah, we will meet again and probably in a better timing, inshallah. Thank you very much for this, and we hope to see you soon, inshallah. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you, Professor Abdullah. Alex promised, because Bahrain is missing in the list of the countries that he visited in the GCC, and therefore we are waiting for this pandemic to end and allow to receive people to next time to come to Ahliya. Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Thank you, Alex. It was a great, actually, afternoon. We've learned a lot, and I'm sure with the number of questions coming, not only questions, by the way, comments as well. Unfortunately, we don't have time to read them, but as Alex promised, I'll post all questions to him in LinkedIn in order to get his reply.
Thanks. So if the people could, yeah. So if either of the people send them to me by LinkedIn, then I can reply to them. But because otherwise, I don't know who sent the question. Or alternatively, you put it on a LinkedIn post. I can reply to that LinkedIn post. So whatever you think works, Jasim. But I'll promise I'll get back to you.
Great.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
All the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All the best.
Okay.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
All the best. Thank you.